Okay, so I am Angel Jones, and this interview is with the wonderful Dr. Berry, and we are Critical Race Studies and Education Association, and she is one of our founding members. The first question, Dr. Berry, if you can just introduce yourself and tell us about your current role.
Okay. So I am Dr. Theodorea Berry, Vice Provost for Student Learning and Academic Success and Dean of the College of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Central Florida. I am also a full professor in the College of Community Innovation and Education in the Department of Learning and Research here at UCF as well. And that's my story.
Okay, I'm sure we'll dig deeper into that story. But what would you say is your role as a founder with regards to Critical Race Studies and Education Association?
Well, I have to say I had the distinct pleasure of being invited to engage in a conversation. Oh, wow. I was a postdoc and just earned my degree not long into it. And because I had a good working relationship with Marvin Lynn and Dave Stovall, I was doing, interestingly enough, I was doing my postdoc at the University of Illinois at Chicago. David Stovall was already at UIC. Dr. Lynn had just arrived as a faculty member and director for the elementary ed program there. And we were all having a conversation about how to get CRT more present in the academic space, and what does it mean to engage in a public scholarship. And we had several conversations with some of our other colleagues around what we really wanted to do. Did we want a research group? Did we want a working group? Did we want an association? Did we want to be apart from AERA? Did we want to be included with AERA? How did we want this to look like? What kind of conversation did we really want to have? How did we want to, and who did we want to have involved in it? Because, and this was part of how we made certain decisions about becoming an association. So for instance, in our conversation around possibly becoming a SIG or some other group in AERA, we immediately decided that wouldn't necessarily be a good fit in the tradition of CRT, having started as a grassroots organization and thinking about the people who were involved in that conversation coming from multiple disciplines, even though it was led by people in the legal field. We were like, wait, this isn't going to work if we want teachers involved, if we want community activists involved, because ARA isn't quite that space, right? So immediately it was, okay, we don't really think this is going to happen. And so we actually started thinking about, well, maybe we ought to just have a conference so we can have a conversation and get more feedback from people who are interested in what this looks like. So I was very active in the notion of ensuring that all of the pieces of CRT were present. So my two colleagues who I love dearly, they're like little brothers to me because I'm the elder in the group. Thank you very much. Right?
Amen. Let them know.
They come from a very traditional notion of CRT, but from very different sort of standpoints. So Dr. Lynn deals with CRT as theoretical framework, as methodology, that sort of thing. Dr. Stovall is dealing with it as a community activist, but still working with teachers and getting them involved, but both sort of seeing CRT from its basic tenets. I, on the other hand, am drawn to CRT as a result of its outgrowths, right? Okay. I was very interested in counterstory and intersectionality and Asian crit and critical race feminism and those things, right? What does that look like to address CRT from this sort of evolving notion of the nexus of race and power, right? So that was my contribution to the conversation.
Whew. I'm excited. All of those were the right words for me. Okay. So I guess let's focus on that. So how would you say you use CRT in your research, in your practice as an educator? What does that look like for you?
So in my research, I completely honor the work that scholars Derek Bell, Mari Matsuda, Alan Freeman, Kimberly Crenshaw have done to lay the groundwork for what CRT is, and equally important, what CRT is not. But I will tell you that I am a critical race feminist to the core. And I say that because particularly in thinking about the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, Adrienne Wing, Mari Matsuda, and Margaret Montoya, what we experience as women of color, and more particularly what we experience as Black women, is so very different in the conversation around the nexus of race and power and what that looks like. And now I'm starting to investigate what that looks like historically, thinking about Black women in the context of education and where their voices were silenced or erased in the history of education, but also thinking about those Black women who were heard, where colorism fills in, right? Because of all the Black women who made major contributions to the educational endeavor in the United States, most of them tend to follow on one end of the spectrum when we talk about hues, right? With the exception of Mary McLeod Bethune. And it's interesting that she actually probably made the most contributions K to 20 of any education scholar in the United States, period, right? Because she covered the gambit from starting a little preparatory school in Daytona Beach, all the way to founding her own college, and then sitting on the White House as a senior advisor, right? Who else, right? And even then, very few people really know all the work that she's done and might recognize her name, right? And then when they see her, it's like, oh yeah, right? She's really a Black woman. I'm like, yeah, right? But then when we think about all of these other women who made contributions, who most people are more familiar with, like an Ida B. Wells, like an Anna Julia Cooper, when we think about Sadie Moselle Alexander, all of these folks are like on the other end of the spectrum. And so we have to pay attention to the way colorism changes the history of Black women's voices in the educational space, right? So I'm very deeply wedded to the notion of understanding the differences that play out for Black women at the nexus of race and power, and the kinds of things that Black men, as much as they are demonized in relationship to all kinds of spaces, at least get heard in many spaces, right? And so it's interesting in relationship to that. In fact, it's super interesting because as I think about my own role on this campus, I am the senior most Black person, tenured Black person on my campus right now. Just Black person, period. There's a Black man who's the interim chief diversity officer, but he's not a vice provost, he's not a vice president, so he doesn't quite fit in. He's tenured, but I've been in the field longer than he has, so it's interesting. And then there's another Black woman who is the department chair for ed leadership and higher ed, who's been here a couple of years now. And she and I are on the same end of the spectrum as far as hue is concerned, right? So it's been interesting to see how people respond to our presence in the space, right? Lots of other Black women on campus, but we are probably the most noticeable as a result of our particular positions. And so it's an ongoing discussion. I mean, even when we think about Breonna Taylor, right? And the public doesn't seem to be interested much anymore about what is happening in relationship to her case. Yet we're still having conversations about George Floyd. And it's interesting because when you look at the basic demographic profiles of these two people, right? We don't really know if George Floyd even had a job, right? That hasn't been part of the conversation. I can honestly say, I don't know if he had a job. And I don't know if in fact he was doing something he should not have been doing, which caused somebody to call the police. Now, did it mean that the police had the right to treat him the way they did? Absolutely not. But then here is a woman who has a job, who's educated, who was at home in her bed asleep, right? Clearly innocent on all counts, didn't even have, and she's an essential worker. She's an EMT, right? So she was probably putting in 10, 12 hours a day with this pandemic. And yet we've gotten little to no movement on her case.
Whew. I feel like if this wasn't just about the founding of our organization, I'd have all these other questions for you, but I'm going to stay focused. But if we have time, just believe I'm going to come back to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about critical race feminism. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what that means and how that's related to CRT or kind of goes away from it a little bit? What does that look like?
Sure. So critical race feminism, or CRF, is an outgrowth of CRT, which leans very heavily on the work of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw around intersectionality. And Adrienne Catherine Wing, who is a legal scholar at the University of Iowa, really is sort of the foremother of critical race feminism. And the way she describes it is about understanding not only the intersectionality of race and gender in relationship to power, but she then takes it a step further and talks about this notion of multidimensionality. And what she means by that is, not only do we exist at the nexus of race and gender in relationship to power, but we also think and act in ways that are informed by our race and gender in relationship to power. That our identities are inextricably tied, that no one thing is just about our race or just about our gender. And that the knowledge we bring to spaces is about the confluence of those things in the space of power. And as a result, she says that women of color, and particularly Black women, engage in what she calls a multiplicative praxis. Action and reflection that is about our being, our whole being at the nexus of race and gender in the context of power. So for instance, it's one thing for her to be a lawyer and to teach about immigration law and those kinds of things. But then she takes her identity as a Black woman and decides to be, and this is actually something that Kimberly Crenshaw has done too, decides to become involved in the community and in a way that deals with those issues that are directly affecting Black women. Taking her knowledge and her experiences and her whole being and being able to take all those things into that space for the benefit of other Black women. And what she says is that oftentimes much of what Black women do is in service ultimately to Black women, even if it's to our children or if it's to Black men or whatever, but ultimately in service of Black women, because we come from a space that is informed by our identities and our experiences as Black women.
Yes, I'm here for all of that. I support all of that. I think for myself, because I never considered myself a feminist. It was never something I thought of. But when I found CRF, I'm like, yes, like this is it. Like this is what I've been thinking about and feeling. And I feel like it allowed me to name my identity and name what I was thinking and feeling. So I totally support.
Yeah, and because the feminism piece, I think, throws off a lot of people, but it really acknowledges the ways in which gender plays a significant role and is very and identifies us as very different from the experiences of Black men.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to acknowledge that part of the feminism piece bears a burden on Black men to ensure that Black women are heard.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes they are not good at that.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of conversations with Black men lately about similar things and kind of what their role is in uplifting Black women and helping to support them with regards to that. Again, a totally different interview and conversation, so I will keep going. So out of the tenets of CRT or CRT in education, are there specific ones that guide you, your work or your pedagogy?
So the first one, the normalness and ordinariness of race and racism, it just stands out. It is sort of foundational to understanding these notions of power, right? Power for me, and that's the critical piece of critical race theory, critical race feminism, is central to examining everything that we do in relationship to race. So that's key for me in understanding that. But also key for me is notions of intersectionality and the unique voice of color and via counterstorytelling. Both of those, I think, play a significant role in how I not only engage in my work, but also the various terms and positionalities I can use as a way of articulating how things fit together in relationship to my work. Mm-hmm. So I espouse critical race feminism through my work as a curriculum theory scholar. Mm-hmm. Most curriculum theory work was done by men and mostly white men. Mm-hmm. I use that work and then reframe it as a critical race feminist and say, here's what this means to us in relationship to what I'm researching or what I'm doing or what I'm reading. And to let people know, I'm not going to see it the same way. I'm also going to see it with layers, not just some other way. I'm not just turning left or right on it. I'm turning left or right and going up. Right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's difficult sometimes for some people to grasp, because I remember in my early years of writing about it, people were sort of feeling like I was kind of all over the place. And I finally had to say to one of the associate editors for this journal where I'd submitted something to, I said, it's not enough to just take a position, because I don't live in a space as a Black woman who does this work. I have to be able to describe all these things in order for it to make sense. Now, luckily, a few years down the road, when I co-authored a piece with James Jupp, who is currently at University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley, and we were thinking about this notion of second wave white teacher identity work. And he came to me, interestingly enough, and said, I know we're not doing enough, and I need you to co-author this piece with me and tell me what we're missing, right? So I was like, okay, I'm in, right? I'll do it. I said, but don't get mad. And he's like, no, I just need you to just like rip it apart and put all your stuff in it, right? I was like,
Okay.
okay, right? You know, and then he came back to me, he goes, okay, here's what I'm thinking. Tell me what you would do with this, right? Because at some point he realized, okay, I might not want to be blindsided by what she want to say. I might want to take that a spoonful at a time, right?
Yep.
And he's a good guy, so he gets it, right? So we had this conversation, and he's talking about, yeah, you know, we're doing this with white teacher identity work, and we're doing that. I was like, really? Y'all didn't create that. Let me tell you about all the people who've been talking about this stuff long before you guys started writing about it, but never got recognized because it was Black men and Black women. Let's talk about Anna Julia Cooper, right? Let's talk about Elaine Locke. Let's talk about Carter G. Woodson. Let's talk about the obvious one that all of you bring into your work, but you've only read one book he's ever written, and that's Du Bois, right? Right?
Amen. Yes.
So yeah, so he was like, oh, okay, I can live with that. That's cool. We need that. I was like, thank you. Here we are.
I love it. I am here for all of it. You have mentioned counter storytelling. What does that look like in your work?
It looks like a lot of things, actually. The thing that you will notice probably more frequently than not is that I tend to tell my stories in poetic form. So early in my career, in fact, the very first piece I ever wrote and got published was in a book that Daryl Cleveland edited back in 2002. And I can't remember the name of the book. It's on my shelf. A Long Way to Go. And so I had written this chapter about what it's like for a Black woman to be mentored by white people who mean well. But it's like, you don't get it. You don't get it. You don't get it, right? I get that you're trying to lead me down the right road as far as scholarship looks, you know. I said, but this isn't just scholarship. This is my life's work, right? Taking a page out of a scholar educator, Elizabeth Harrison, who did a lot of work in Chicago schools back in the mid to late 19th century. And she used to talk about education being her life's work, and that everything that she had ever experienced, she found a way to build into curriculum and into teaching and so forth and so on. And so I'm trying to tell people, I'm like, this isn't just about my research. This is my life's work, right? And I found that as I was writing this piece, there was analyzing the research in this sort of traditional way. I was struggling to write it that way because I was hearing it in my head a completely different way. And so finally I just said, you know what, I'm just going to write it the way I'm hearing it. And then if I want to move some stuff around, and it's one of the pieces of advice I give to a lot of junior scholars, do a brain dump on the page. Just put everything on the page and then edit it. Don't edit in your head. A lot of young scholars, including myself, who think about, oh, we've got to organize it this way because this is what a journal article is supposed to look like and all this other kind of stuff. And I'm just like, no, just bleed on the page, get everything on there, and then go back and try to make sense of it, right? And that doesn't work for everybody, but it works for me. And when I finished with it, I had this poem that was several pages long, more of a spoken word piece. And Daryl, when I gave it to him, he was like, I'm not sure people are going to understand this. I'm like, do you want it or not? Because this is it, right?
Yeah.
This is what you're getting. So he was like, okay, cool. So he published it. And then shortly after the book was published, we presented chapters of the book at AERA in Chicago that year. And instead of just doing my standard paper, I told the audience, I'm just going to read you the findings, which is actually in poetic form. And it worked. So I find that oftentimes my version of counter story is really about in presenting it in this almost rhythmic conversation, the way in which Black people engage in conversation or engage in monologue. You know, we're not just engaging in this conversation or in this speech. We're spitting knowledge, right? We're filling our truth, filling the air up with our own truth, right? So that works for me. I can do the other stuff, you know, we're all trained to do that, you know, kind of like seals with a ball on our nose. We know how to balance it, right? You know? But that's not how I find myself engaging and articulating what I find in my research. And so that's my version of counter story. And I'm really sort of thinking about it also as a way of giving a unique voice to color, right? To people of color. Because this notion of engaging in that kind of thing has existed for Black people from almost the moment we hit these shores, when you had Black people who would celebrate and would give these speeches that had this rhythmic form, the way Black people preached in churches, the way Black people even do poetry. When you think about the writings of people like Toni Morrison, and how fluid the work is, Zora Neale Hurston, and the way they tell stories. So for me, that's what storytelling is about. It's not just reporting something out. And it's not just reporting something out from a particular positionality that relates to the experience of people of color. It's reporting it out the way we would tell a story.
I feel like I just want to sit at your feet. Because I feel like we have a lot in common just in terms of counter storytelling. So I love doing it as poetry too. So when I defended my dissertation, I had that same, I guess, feeling where I'm just like, I don't want it to just be regular or basic or whatever that means, right? So I presented my data as a spoken word piece, because for me that felt authentic to who I am and to my participants. So I love that that's where you are and what you do too.
Yeah. So when I did my dissertation, because I'm also a musician, right? So I'm always listening to different kinds of work that people are doing, and I framed my entire dissertation with music, right? So different artists who had so like I got Lauryn Hill and Yolanda Adams and a whole bunch of other people just sort of sprinkled throughout my dissertation. And even in my findings section, it reads like a novel, you know, because at the time I was reading a lot of work from I want to say it was Toni Morrison. Who's the other woman? Oh my gosh, I can't think of her name. Anyway, so and the beauty of it was because my participants in my study were Black college students, I didn't have to reframe it. I could just use their words, right? And it was just magnificent. So yeah, and it was funny because I gave copies of my dissertation to all of my student participants. And it was really pretty cool to say, see, you can do this, right? And your name is in this, because they actually let me use their real names in my dissertation. So
I love it. Okay, angel focus. Okay, I'm so excited. How do you think CRT connects to the larger field?
To the field of education? Well, the reality is there's been a lot of conversation about how to connect to pedagogically and through curriculum to connect to Black students. When I was in my master's program, a lot of that conversation was very deficit oriented. We can't reach these kids. They can't learn the way we're teaching them. How do we come up with some creative ways, that sort of thing. And then Lisa Delpit published her Other People's Children. And all of a sudden people were like, oh, we kind of did this wrong. Like, you think? Right? And then Gloria Ladson-Billings came out with the Dream Keepers and was like, oh, we really messed this up.
Yep.
And it was funny because part of the reason why people were having troubles because right around the time these two women are doing their very life-affirming work, you have John Ogbu, who's saying, you know, you got to act white if you're going to do school well, right? And I can tell you, you know, I don't like to talk badly of dead people, but
oh Jesus. I wasn't ready for that. Okay.
But I didn't like his work at all. Zero. He does nothing for me. He didn't do anything but psychologically damage a whole lot of people about valuing their identities in school spaces. Because basically, you know, he does this big research project out in Shaker Heights, Ohio, for all these Black kids, middle class or upper class, and they're going to these schools and they're performing well because they know how to act white. And I was just like, really? Okay.
Amen.
Right. Now, I have to admit, part of my pushback on that comes from my own experience.
Okay.
So as a result, you know, I had Black teachers, excellent Black teachers, all the way through elementary school, through at least 50% of middle school and about 30% of high school. Really good teachers. Now, part of that was because I had a parent who taught school. And so she knew how to navigate the system to get us where we needed to be, right? And trust me when I tell you, she was on the phone. I heard they got an opening at this school. I need my kids over there. Right? She had the connects, right? So, but CRT really counters not only these deficit notions, but it also honors students' identities in the curricular space, in the pedagogical space. But what we're still battling is the flip side of that coin, which is where power exists in those spaces. So one of the things that people, I really hope that some of my teacher education peers and colleagues will do is start talking more about the damage that white people are doing to Black and brown children. Some of them are doing great work, but I think they're in a really small minority because they are authentic in their relationship to who they are, who their students are, and what their community is, right? But most of them are faking the funk. We love our kids. We love teaching. I was like, yeah, whatever. And it's funny because I wrote a chapter in a book for Syracuse a few years ago that talks about a research project I engaged in, trying to get a number of teachers who were in a master's program I was teaching in to understand what it means to truly understand the communities where they teach and who their students are. So this was back in the time frame when lots of teachers were being encouraged to go on these community walks through their school communities. And normally what they would do is they take a group of teachers out in the middle of the day and walk around the block. And then these teachers could swear they knew everything they need to know about the community, right? Mm-hmm. Going on these little community walks. And so I made the decision that my students in this master's program would do a version of that. But what I decided that I wanted them to do was to first walk around their own community, mm-hmm. where they lived. And they had to take pictures of those things that were significant in their community. And I deliberately gave them that assignment first, so I could see what they came back with as the things that they deemed to be significant in their community. Mm-hmm. Schools, churches, playgrounds, all that stuff, right? And then I told them to go into their school communities and do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Walk around the community with some sort of camera, camcorder, whatever you want, because, you know, iPhone didn't have all those features, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, you want us to walk all the way around the community? Can't we just drive? Can we have somebody else take the pictures for us? You know, and these are men and women. And so finally, somebody was brave enough to say, well, Dr. Berry, it's not safe to walk around our community. And I said, you might be right. And your children, your students are in danger every day, but they come to school every day. And they go home every day. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't going to go down the road where I was going to question how safe they felt, because, you know, they'll come for you on that one. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's like, you don't want me to be safe? Oh my God, right? I was like, you're right. You work there, you know how safe it is and how safe it isn't. Mm-hmm. I got you. But trust me when I tell you, if your students can come back and forth to school every day and it's not safe, you can do it too. And then you could hear a pin drop.
I bet.
Folks were like, oh, okay, we got to figure this out then. Mm-hmm. You know, now most people, what they ended up doing was going like early on a Sunday morning when they thought it would be like super quiet. Mm-hmm. Okay. But then they had to walk by all the local churches with that.
I was going to say Sunday morning in the. Okay.
But it was a lesson for them. It was like, wait, all of our kids, we pass them when we walk by the church. They all go to church on Sunday. Mm-hmm. I was like, what did you think they did on Sunday? Mm-hmm. But we didn't really think about it.
That's the problem. You're not thinking about what your babies are doing.
And so, you know, and this is why CRT is so important, right? Mm-hmm. Because they've got this neoliberal version of the world. Mm-hmm. Oh, we love everybody, but we don't want to walk through your neighborhood, right? Mm-hmm. You know, oh, we don't believe in slavery, but I don't want you living next door to me, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff, right? But it was interesting because there were two. So at one point, about a weekend, two of those teachers came to me and said, Dr. Berry, is it okay that we do our project together? We work in the same school, we teach the same grade. I was like, sure, no problem. They came up with a really interesting idea that really changed their whole world. They decided to give all of their students permission slips, asking their parents or guardians for permission to walk their children home from school. And what they anticipated, so, you know, they didn't start out with the right spirit in this, right? Because they were hoping that most of these kids, because part of it too is the fact that a lot of these kids, you know, they get permission slips to go on trips and most of them don't return them when they should, right? So they were anticipating, oh, we'll only get half of them. We'll split them up between the two of us. We'll be done. We're good, right? So they thinking, we're going to send home these permission slips, tell the parents we want to walk the kids home from school. We might get half of them at best. It'll be fine. The next day, every single permission slip came back.
Amen.
So they came to class. They were like, Dr. Berry, we got all of our permission slips back. I was like, is that right? I never get that. I was like, gee, I wonder why. We don't know why either. I said, well, when do you normally send out permission slips? Well, we want to take the kids on a trip or something like that. I was like, but you're not doing anything for them, right? And they were like, what? I was like, yeah, because normally somebody comes to pick up that young child, because these were second graders that they were teaching. Somebody comes to pick up that young child, or some older sibling has to walk them home. You are now taking care of that for them. And here's the other piece. You're going to learn something very interesting about that community by doing this. And they were like, what? I said, you'll find out when you do it. So they started, what they would do is they put all the permission slips in a fishbowl. And the first day, the teacher drew the permission slip and said, okay, Susie, tell your mom and dad, I'll be walking you home from school tomorrow, right? And then Susie would pick the next name the next day, right? And what they discovered was that these people were super excited that the teacher was coming to their house. These two white women were like, every house we went to, they offered us food. They had like family members and friends at the house to meet us. They said they were lucky if they were only at somebody's house for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
They were there usually an hour.
Wow.
And if they were there when it got dark, because it was wintertime, so it would get dark early, somebody would offer to walk them to their car.
I love it.
Every single time. She was like, we didn't know they cared about their kids so much. I was like, oh, Jesus. Help me. Help me.
How you mess up such a beautiful moment by saying something so, amen.
But here was what was really cool. So one day, they're walking this little girl home. And part of the reason why they would give a day's notice so that they could have all the information they needed and know which way to go, right? And one of the teachers is walking this little girl home, and she passes the local bar, and there's a bunch of guys standing out there with their little brown paper bags, you know, the whole thing, right? And they stop her. And they ask the little girl, who is that with you? Do I need to call your grandmother? Right? And the teacher said she was astonished that they were questioning her. Like, why are you with her? Who are you to her? Right? And the little girl was like, oh, this is my teacher. And the men were like, well, what is your name? And so she gives them her name. They were like, and how long you been teaching at the school? I mean, they start questioning her, like, how long you been there? What do you teach? You know, where do you live? And she said she was just astonished that these men who she assumed were just bums outside the bar drinking out of their brown paper bags, right? And I have to admit, if I pass somebody on the street drinking out of a brown paper bag, I might think the same thing, right? But they knew this little girl and they knew her family. And they're like, who is this? Are you okay?
Right.
She was astonished. And then she gets to the house, her grandmother, her mother, her brothers are there. They had all this food cooked for her. And then they wrapped up food and said, look, take it home. You married, you got a husband, you got to feed him too.
Mm-hmm.
She said she had the best macaroni and cheese in her life.
Whew, I'm jealous.
But this is the nexus of race and power, right?
Right, yeah.
But here was even the better outcome. Half of them kids in her class did not like her.
Mm-hmm.
She used to come to classes talking about those kids are so bad, they disrespectful, they don't pay her any attention, they don't care about her, they call her names, all this stuff. I was like, these are second graders acting like that. She said, it takes me all day to get through a lesson. They telling me to shut up. Right?
Right.
She said after she went through that activity, she got all kinds of respect from the parents. Mm-hmm. And she said, and the kids stopped misbehaving in her class. Mm-hmm. Because now they knew that she knew their parents. She was like, I got extra time. I can let them color at the end of the day and stuff like. She said, because I don't spend all day putting people in a corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm.
She said, and this one little boy, it took him a minute to finally get with the program, and he was acting crazy. And she said, finally, this one little girl turned and she said, you know, she know your mama. You better sit down.
Let him know, mama.
And he looked, and the teacher was like, yes, I did meet your mother. And he sat down. She said she didn't have any more problems out of him.
All right.
Right. But then this switched the power dynamic. This really relates to something that Bill Ayers says in his book, To Teach, all the time. Parents know their children better than anybody. Mm-hmm. And if you don't partner with them in that education endeavor, you will lose out and that student will lose out. But when you partner with them, anything is possible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She said the whole school year is gone by. These parents would be sending her food, they give her gifts, all this stuff. She said if she had known that just that one small gesture would have changed what her relationship was with these parents, mm-hmm. she would have done it years ago. Because this was somebody who had been teaching like 8-9 years.
Oh, wow. Mm. CRT is so amazing. Oh my goodness.
And that's how I put it into practice in my classroom. So even though I'm teaching a class that deals with pedagogy, like, so this was a pedagogy class, mm-hmm. CRT was in every single assignment I gave. Mm-hmm. And I forced the class had nothing but white people in it that lived out in the suburbs of Rockford, Illinois. And they didn't realize what they were getting until they got to their last assignment for that class. And they were like, you really kind of tricked us. I was like, really? Did I trick you or did I educate you? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we got a diversity class and a pedagogy class. That's what you did. I was like, mm-hmm. Yep, that's what I did. Mm-hmm. Put that on my evaluation. Thank you very much.
I love it. And I do this. So I teach at George Washington University, which is predominantly white students. And I teach the intro to higher ed. So when they come in, they don't know that.
Brian Casemore.
Mm-hmm. Yes. My cubicle is actually right next to his office. But yeah, so they come in for an intro class, not knowing that they're going to get a diversity class when they take my class. And they're very uncomfortable in the beginning, but then by the end, they totally understand it. I just feel like if we're going to teach educators, I want you to know who you are before you walk into a space. I want you to know how you're coming off, who you're in. Like, I definitely go in. So I love that you do that with your students too. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about mentorship. So what has the role of mentors been like for you? And then kind of what has your role as a mentor been?
Well, I have to say, I've had a lot of unofficial mentors who serve different purposes along the way. So for instance, when I was collecting my data for my dissertation, I actually relocated to North Carolina to collect my data for my dissertation. I was functioning like a true anthropologist, right? And most of my peers were like, well, why couldn't you just do your research in Chicago? And why didn't you just change your topic so you could do your research? I was like, no, I'm doing what I'm doing. And if I got to go someplace else to do what I need to do, I'm gone. Deuces. So, and because my chair and my committee were in Chicago, and this is, you know, we have internet and email and all that kind of stuff, but people were still getting kind of adjusted to it, right? This is 20 years ago. And I found I really needed somebody like right there in the square to really sort of set me straight. And I reached out, I had met George Noblet at a conference. And he was the one who introduced me to Daryl Cleveland, because Daryl was one of George's students. And I contacted him and said, hey, look, I got some stuff I'm trying to work on in relationship to my dissertation. Can you help me? He got me to a point and then said, you know what? I'm going to introduce you to Kathleen Casey, who was at UNC Greensboro, great qualitative methodologist who does narrative work. He's like, she can help you unpack the rest of this. You know, I got into my postdoc. My official mentor was Bill Ayers. My unofficial mentor, who got me squared away on the professional stuff, is a guy named by the name of Bill Trent, who's at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And he loved my work, but by the time I finished my dissertation, I was one angry Black woman, and I had something to say about everything. And he would check me and be like, you can't tell people off all the time. He said, I need you to dial that back a minute. And I will tell you, it was more his spouse, Mildred, who was my soror, who was really able to get me, because he would just be like, you can't do that. And she would look at him and be like, you know that she didn't really hear you the way you said that, right? And she would be like, nah, baby, let me help you out here. You know, they're not gonna really listen to you, kind of like you didn't listen to him, right? If you keep squaring off with people. And I was like, I get it, but I still don't like it. You know, and when I was working on my dissertation, I had a tenure track faculty position. So I was one of these people that had a tenure track faculty position and got out of it to do a postdoc, right?
Oh.
Yeah, people don't do that.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Right? I wouldn't recommend it.
Yes, ma'am.
But it worked out. And the dean for the School of Ed, where I was working, she was a wonderful mentor, really got me squared away. And she got me connected to one of her faculty members, who was the person who helped me get the postdoc, because I had never written an application for a grant or anything like that before. I couldn't tell you what that looked like. But this guy had multi-million-dollar grants for all kinds of research. So I'm like, look, I need the quick and dirty lesson. What do I need to do here? How do I fix it? Because they were asking for budget information and FTEs. I couldn't tell you what FTE was. And he was phenomenal. I mean, I learned so much in the short semester that we spent working together on this application. I could not even imagine. And those lessons have served me well even today. And then at some point, I got to Texas, and a colleague of mine was there, Michael Jennings, who's now at Furman University. And Mike was always good about how to position yourself so that you could gain access to certain things. And so he was a really good mentor. And so even though he and I had finished school, we had finished school like a year apart from each other. He was really good at, feeding that kind of information to me and helping me to, figure out how to navigate that. And I still have some really good mentors today, some folks who have helped me to sort of navigate what it means to be a full-time administrator. So I've been an administrator my entire career. I've always been a faculty member and an administrator. So having more than one job, right? I'm a typical Caribbean person. I got more than one job all the time. Right?
Nothing wrong with that.
Right. And but this is the first time I've had more than one job, and one of those jobs didn't include teaching. So I am not teaching at all right now.
Okay.
And it's an odd feeling. But at the same time, I'm doing a lot of mentoring. So like right now, I just hired a postdoc research scholar for my division. And there was a lot that she did not learn in her doctoral program, which is not uncommon for a lot of people right out of doctoral programs. There's just stuff that nobody tells you. They say, yeah, you should publish and you should interview, and I'll read over your narrative letter or your cover letter for your job, or here's what my CV looks like. But how to navigate that space and how to make sure that you're doing things that are connected together. Those are things that people just don't tell you. Nobody told me, right? I had to figure it out. And then some folks kind of came in and out in spaces and helped me to figure out if I was doing it right or wrong. So I'm now helping this particular scholar make the most of the 2 years that she's going to be with me, so that she is able to get into the job market with some knowledge and a plan, and how she can articulate that plan, right? Mentoring doctoral students, which has always been a joy for me, has been about all those experiences I've gained along the way and figuring out what will fit in best with where that person is, right? So I have a doctoral student I'm working with now from my former institution out at San Jose State, who's a real activist. She's a member of the union, the California California Teachers Union rather, and she's in the California Faculty Association, and really pushing hard for ethnic studies in K-12 schools and that sort of thing. I had to tell her, I was like, all of that is great, but you got to figure out how to make everything work for you twice. If you out here in these streets advocating for these young people to get an education about themselves, it better show up in your dissertation and then in a presentation and then in a manuscript, right? You got to figure out how to make it work for you. And she's teaching full time. So I'm just like, you need to be smart about this. So she's doing a documentary. But I told her, I said, once you get the video and you make a decision about how you're going to analyze the video and put it together in a way that seems seamless so that you have these headings and whatnot, then you need to transcribe it so that you can take pieces of it and publish it. And she was like, wait, what? I was like, yeah, that part. She was like, oh, okay. But, people don't tell you this stuff, right? So, and I still, mentor a lot of my former doctoral students. I got one who finished it at UTSA. I was on her committee. She's now applying for jobs at institutions, trying to get a tenure track faculty position. I got another one who's at Auburn. as a faculty member. She finished last year. Yeah, she finished last year. And she's trying to get involved in all this movement building on her campus with these college students. And I'm like, you better be writing about it. Because when they decide, because it's not going to be if, it's going to be when they decide to start questioning your activity and whether or not you are collegial, you better have the receipts.
Thanks.
Right? And because this movement building is time consuming, and you're going to give up something in exchange for it, you cannot let it be your writing.
That is so true.
So,
okay.
You know, I've benefited from these great mentors, and I've had some unofficial mentors who have taught me some hard lessons, like, okay, I know who you are now, and I will know you when I see you again. Right. And at the same time, I'm passing on that information to folks that I've worked with, folks that I've taught, and said, you know, when you see this, know what it is, know how to deal with it, and you can't say nobody didn't tell you.
All right. That actually leads perfectly into my last question. What advice do you have for grads or maybe early career scholars that are wanting to use CRT in their work?
First, understand the foundational work. There are a lot of young CRT scholars that have not read anything outside of CRT and Introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. They think they know CRT because they read that book. That's a good place to start, but that is no way to get into it. You gotta read Derek Bell's early papers. You got to read Mari Matsuda. You got to read Ian Lopez. You got to read Margaret Montoya, Kimberly Crenshaw, Devin Carbato. You got to read all of those folks, right? Now, one of the ways in which to absorb that information is through some collections, right? So, and I don't have them here, they're at home, but there is a book called CRT Key Writings in the Field. That has a collection of scholarship in CRT divided by subgroups or subheadings. That is
is that the really big red book?
Yep.
Okay, I have that one.
That is really a reprint of a lot of key foundational journal articles, right? There's another book, Temple University Press. It's called Critical Race Theory. I can't think of the rest of it. That's also sort of a collection type book, foundational in the field. But I will tell you, the most important thing is to read the actual legal papers. And it's what Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate did when they introduced it to the field. They had to go to LexisNexis and to the law school and find the papers written by, and the articles and the briefs written by Derek Bell and Richard Delgado, Alan Freeman, all of those folks, because they were actually writing stuff based on what they were either teaching in class or based on court stuff, right? Because you got to understand that the legal field is going to write and cite things very differently than the way we do it in the social sciences. But then when you get to education, you got to read, obviously, the Ladson-Billings and Tate piece as foundational to the field of education. And you got to understand the basic 6 tenets that Derek Bell and Alan Freeman put together and juxtapose them with the tenets that Daniel Solorzano did with Tarioso to see how they are reframing that, right? But you should also become familiar with the work in Lat Crit and Asian Crit and critical race feminism, because foundationally they start with CRT, but they make visible some things in relationship to race and power that are not likely to be visible any other way. So know the foundational stuff, first and foremost. Secondly, you got to write. And the only way to write and to get good at writing is to keep writing and to write more. But the third thing is to listen, because critical race theory is really all around us. And we are in the midst of critical race moments all the time. This is a critical race moment. And you'll figure out the multiple layers of that after we finish this call, right? And it reminds me of the work that Robin Hughes and Mark Giles did on crit walking. Race and power exist on all of our spaces, and particularly on college campuses, right? I got to this campus and the first thing I noticed that there is a statue of the founder of this university on the front of the campus. And they, and it wasn't called University of Central Florida at the time, it was called Florida Polytechnic, because the school was founded in relationship to the space program and sciences. And so that's how they got started. And so you have this statue with this man with his hand up to the sky, like reach for the stars kind of thing. And I'm just like, that's interesting. And the building I work in is named after him. And I'm just like, wow. And yet 60% of our students identify as an ethnic minority. 60%. We are a minority majority institution. And when you walk around this campus, with the exception of the big wall with the pride paint mural on it, there is no indication that this is a minority majority institution. Not one. Not one plaque, not one mural, not one statue, nothing.
Okay. I feel like there's so many ways we can take that. I've taken a lot of your time. Okay, do you have any, I guess, closing words for us based on anything we talked about or anything you want people to know?
Well, I just know that I will be involved with the Critical Race Studies and Ed Association for the rest of my life in some way, shape, form, or fashion. I believe in the power of mentorship and supporting scholars in their work, particularly in this field. And I am grateful to be so privileged as to be able to do this kind of work. Academics in general are privileged people in privileged spaces. And regardless as to whether or not they wanted us in this space, our lives are very different from the average, ordinary, run-of-the-mill, garden variety people who go to work every day. We get to do the work that we love. We get paid for it. Not necessarily so great all the time, right?
Amen.
But we get paid for it. We get to exercise our brains all the time. And a lot of folks are envious of us, to the point where there's still this myth floating around the planet that if you are a college professor, you must make a whole lot of money. You got a PhD, you must be rich.
Yeah, I had to break my mama's heart when I defended. I was like, no, mommy, I'm not rich all of a sudden.
But I mean, and that's across race and ethnicity. It's like, oh, you must be fabulously comfortably because you're a college professor with a PhD. And I'm just like, no, it doesn't quite work that way.
Yeah.
And we go through 10, 12 years of school and have debt on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So, but we're still privileged.
Absolutely.
And we need to use our powers for good everywhere we can.
I love it. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Berry, and thank you so much for your time in general. I really appreciate you.
You're welcome.